Hello and welcome. In this video, we will be creating a Node.js Hello World application, but not using JavaScript but TypeScript. We will be creating this in a fully object-oriented fashion. We will use Visual Studio Code for our code editing as well as use the integrated debugging capabilities for Visual Studio. We will demonstrate using the Jest package for unit testing. We will demonstrate using ESLint for finding errors in TypeScript. This is going to be an action-packed tutorial, so I will move along quickly, but I will post a GitHub repository with all of the code that is in this tutorial. So let's get started. I'm going to create a projects folder. And then we are going to do npm init to, so first of all, you need to have npm and node installed on your computer. You can do that by sudo apt install node node.js and npm if you don't have that already. Now we're going to do npm init. You can do -y to make this run silently, but we will do the interactive prompt. Project name is Hello World version 1.0.0. Description TypeScript Hello World. Entry point we'll use build main.js. We'll see why later, but this is also kind of just description. Test command, skip that. Git repository, skip that. Keyword, skip that. Author Matt Verghese. License, we will use GPL 3.0. And yes, and then we will start Visual Studio Code in this project. Once Visual Studio Code opens, we can see the package.json file. We will open a terminal, and now we need to install TypeScript. We need TypeScript, and we will also install at type/node. See how this was installed as a dev dependency because of the save dev, because we don't need TypeScript to actually run the final output. We just need it to compile, so it's just a development requirement. The next step is to initialize the TypeScript compiler configuration. So this is the tsconfig.json file. To create that, we will use the npx tsc command with the init option. We have a whole bunch of options specified. You can look at it in the GitHub repository, but our tsconfig.json file has been created with the options that we defined. Now we'll add an include option here to say that you only compile the files in our source directory. And then we will create the source directory at this level and add a main.ts file inside of that. Console.log hello world. Let's try running that. Because our tsconfig is set up, compile the source directory into the build directory, our main.js got created here, and we also making source maps for debugging. That's one of the options that was given to the tsconfig file. So now, this runs our program. The next step is to make this into a basic Node.js Hello World HTTP server. You have likely seen the standard Hello World example that is given on the Node.js documentation. We will copy paste that into our code. Now we will convert this to TypeScript. Add type annotations. Because we gave the compiler option to not allow a parameter that is not used, we need to use an underscore to bypass that. We'll wrap this code in a try catch block. Now let's try running this. So now our server is running on localhost. So if we go to localhost 3000, we get the hello world. Next, we will add some npm scripts to our package.json. We'll remove the test script and we will replace it by a build script. Notice that even though we just used npx.txt, I am going to do npm install. In my GitHub code, I have a clean script which is using a cleanall.ts file, and if you clean and remove the node modules directory, then you need to do npm install to have that reinstalled, which is why that is there. And before we start, we want to always make sure that we have built it, which is why we are adding the npm run build before the build node build main.js command. So now we can do npm run start or npm start to run the server, and it will build and run the server. Control F5 will still give you the content. Next we will add Visual Studio tasks. So we can go to Visual Studio configure tasks. And because we have these build scripts, it automatically suggests adding the build and start, and it also suggests an install task. We'll add all these three. So now I can run task from Visual Studio and run the start task, and that will run my server. Oops. We have a server already running, so we have to first close it before we start. So do that again. There we go. The server is running. Control F5 refreshes the page. Exit out of the server. Now what if you want to debug this application? That is when let's try doing that with a breakpoint. So now in Visual Studio you can go to run and debug, create a launch.json file, and then we will use Node.js, but you can use this or you can add a different configuration. So we will use a add configuration npm start base configuration, and then we will remove the default one. We just needed this to make a launch.json file. Either of them work. So let's try running this. And we should also add a pre-launch task dependency on our npm build task so that things are built before we try to run. Okay, so now we are ready to run. This runs the build. Remember, we have our breakpoint. So now we have a server listening. If we do Control F5, that hits our breakpoint, and we can step through code, do whatever you want in terms of debugging, and figure out what is a bug if you have one. Alright, so now we have a basic HTTP Hello World server. We need to convert this into object-oriented code. So for that, we are going to add a new file, HTTP server.ts. We can copy paste the main code into the HTTP server and then start modifying from here. First, we need to export a new class. And I'm going to copy paste code, so bear with me because otherwise this tutorial would be really long. So we are declaring a port, a hostname, a handler, and a server. But this is a type alias. We haven't defined this type alias. Let's do that now. So there's our type alias. Now we can remove this code here. Now what we need to do is listen on the server and also have a way to stop the server. So we will add two functions for that. Note here that this .server.listen takes a callback function, and in the previous case we were using that callback function to print to the console that the server is running, but now we want to make sure that the server was successfully launched. That's all we care about. So we create a promise so that there is a resolver function passed as a callback function. And when this resolver function gets called, the promise resolves so that our await succeeds, and therefore this function will return when the resolver function gets called. This is a pattern for converting callbacks into promises. I won't go into it more than that, but basically we have a start server. Similarly, we have a stop server function which will call the close method on the server. So now we can export this class and remove the rest of this code. Next, we need to update our main.ts to use this code. We'll convert this into a handler function which we will pass to our class. Then inside our try block, we will create a new HTTP server. So our HTTP server is not getting resolved, so we can do and see how Visual Studio actually automatically did the import for us. So we create the server, passing it the port and hostname and handler. We can actually move these into the try block, and then we await on the start server. However, this await has a complaint on it that an await cannot be outside of a function in earlier versions of ECMAScript. So we will wrap this around a main function. And then just call that function here. We still need to make this an async function, so now we can remove this line and then Control A, Control K, Control F will format the code for us. Now we are going to add some code to run this server for 15 seconds. So here we have the set timeout being used again in the promise pattern to resolve in 15 seconds. And so this server will run for 15 seconds and then call the stop server and terminate the server. So let's try this out. Server is running, Control F5, we get a response, and then go back there. In 15 seconds, the server will stop running. And so now we have a modularized code base where we have an HTTP server class which has a start and stop method in it, and it accepts a handler. We are ready to do some unit testing. We will use the Jest package for our unit testing. For that, we need to npm install Jest, TS Jest requires TS node, and we also need type/jest so that we can use describe and it calls in the unit test. And then we also need to create a Jest configuration file. So we will add a jest.config.ts file, and I'm going to copy paste this as well. So this config file is saying we will use TS_jest. The test environment is Node. This you want to read up on what this means. I'm not going to get into that. And we are also limiting our test files to TS files. We don't want JavaScript to be picked up by the test framework. So now we can try making a test. So inside the source folder, we will create a tests folder. And inside of that, we will create HTTP server.test.ts. Now if we run npx jest, everything is configured correctly, but we will get an error that we don't have any test suites in there. There should be at least one test. So let's put some tests in here. So now we have created a test script. There's one test suite for the HTTP server test, and there are two test cases. We want to check that the server returns the status code of 200 and it returns the string provided by the handler. So now let's populate the test code. We've added some local variables to track the host name, the port, and the response message that the server will send back. And then we are creating a handler which will send that response message back. So this is the before each method, which will be called before each test case. And in that, we are creating the HTTP server and starting it. And the after each method will stop the server once that test case is done. Now let's resolve these. So if we do TypeScript will automatically do that for us. And then we also need an HTTP import. So now all of that is resolved. Now let's write out our test case. The first test case is that when we call the server, we expect the result status code to be 200. And we need async here. So again, we are using a promise to call the HTTP modules get method against our own server. And we expect that the status code is 200. The second test case is a bit more involved. Again, async here. Now we create the server, use the get method to hit our server, and then we need to use the HTTP data event because we might get multiple packets, so there may be many pieces of data coming in. We need to construct the whole request body, which is why we have a callback here on the data event. And then once the end event fires, which only fires once, so we can use the promise pattern, we have all the response data. So once we have all of the result body, we verify, we expect the result body to be the response message that we sent in the response handler from our server. So now let's try running our tests. So we have an error because we didn't save our JS config file. So let's try that again. Or just config file. So yeah, now our test cases have both passed. So now we will add a script for the test. In our package.json, we'll add the test script. We'll first build before the test just so that everything has been built for the updated code. So now you can do, once I save it, now you can do npm run test, and this will run the Jest test scripts. So the next step here after that is done is to have a task.config configuration created for the test. We'll do that similarly to how we did before. And one thing to note here is we don't want Visual Studio copying everything from the npm scripts. We can actually do npm run build here, npm run start here, npm run test here. So now you can also run from the Visual Studio run task the test script, but that's not our ultimate goal. We want to be able to debug this test. So let's put a breakpoint here. And how can we launch this test? So in the launch config.json, we want to add a configuration for the Jest test case. If you look here, we don't have any Jest test cases. This is because we don't have the extension for Jest installed. We'll install the Jest extension. And then if we go back to add a configuration here, and here now we can see the Jest configuration. We are going to use the default Jest configuration. And again, we want a pre-launch task. We'll use the npm run build pre-launch task. So now we have a breakpoint in our HTTP server, and we will run the VS Code Jest test. This causes our breakpoint to hit and our test pass. So now we are able to debug our Jest test scripts as well. The next step is to use ESLint for catching errors in TypeScript. We will install the relevant packages for ESLint. Next, we will add an ESLint RC file, .ESLint RC. So now this file is saying use the TypeScript ESLint parser and what plugins to use, what additional rules to use, etc. So, and then finally we will add a ESLint script. So now if we run npm run lint, we see one error, which is an unnecessary semicolon on HTTP server.ts on line 22, column 2. So this semicolon, we can just remove it, or we can do a comment ESLint disable line on that line, or we can do a comment on the previous line ESLint disable next line. So let's try running that again. And this time there are no warnings or errors. So to wrap up, we created a Hello World standard Node.js server, but with the differences that we are using TypeScript, we are doing it in a fully object-oriented fashion. We are using Visual Studio integration for both development and for debugging, including debugging unit tests. We are using Jest package for unit testing, and we are using ESLint for linting our TypeScript code. The sample code for all of this is in my GitHub repository, the link to which I will post in this YouTube video. And if you like this video, please hit the like button. Subscribe to this channel for future videos coming out on a TypeScript full course that I am planning to develop. And I look forward to seeing you on the next videos. Thank you guys.